Right, hello, it's me again. We are trying to keep on schedule for particularly people who are watching remotely, who might not, appreciate the vagaries of us taking breaks every now and again. So, because they're watching from home, as it were. So, welcome to those of you watching online. I spoke earlier about the role of the Trade Association, and we're quite an active association in the sense we don't just do sort of lobbying and talking to journalists. We are also roll our sleeves up and get our hands dirty in doing some actual delivery, which we were thankfully able to do with the help of grant funding. In one case from the European Commission originally, and now from the Safe Online organisation, which is the same fund that is actually subsidising the overall conference. And then in parallel on a separate project, Project DefAI, which Deepak is going to talk about after me, where we've got money from the UK and Swiss government's innovation funds. So euCONSENT was a project which was initiated by members of the European Parliament, and they were sort of put up to this by a chap called Ono, who is around here at this conference this week. And essentially what MEPs realised was that they were passing a lot of legislation requiring people to prove their age online, but there simply weren't any good ways of proving your age online as far as they could see, and certainly not in a convenient, user-friendly way which sort of was compliant with GDPR. So they required the Commission to put out a tender, a call for a proposal for people to help with age verification and also the associated parental consent. So when within the EU you discover that somebody is under anything between 13 and 16, depending on the age that the member state has selected, you then need to get parental consent if you want to share their data based on consent as the legal basis for your processing. So the call for a proposal was to tackle both age verification and parental consent. We put together a consortium with a number of other age verification providers, but also a number of academics and audit practices and communication specialists. We essentially set out to find a way of solving this problem of interoperable age verification. So having proven your age to one website, you'd be able to reuse that age verification on other sites as well. What we've done since that project, which sort of ran during 2021 and 22, is to create a non-profit organisation in Brussels, euCONSENT ASBL, to which we donated all the intellectual property so that there was an entity that you might, as you could say, would keep the dream alive, would take forward the work of the project, even though there was no longer a grant providing funding from the European Union. And all the consortium partners who'd won the original grant became founding members of the ASBL organisation. So who was involved? We had 6 tech companies, so Upcom Minds, who really did the heavy lifting on building the technology. JustProg is a charitable organisation in Germany, which is already heavily involved in online child protection there, and they took the lead on parental consent. And then there were 3 age verification providers, so AgeChecked, which is run by Alistair Graham, who's here, Yoti, run by Robin Toombs, who is also here at a point this week. Age Verify is a sort of subsidiary of Upcom Minds, so is more of a brand than a particular separate entity. And then Verify My Age, who is another one of our members. And so essentially those companies came together to figure out the tech. We then worked with Lysol experts in Romania, obviously the Trade Association, Ono, the guy behind the whole idea in the first place, and then John Carr, OBE, who runs the Children's Charities Coalition for Internet Safety here in the UK, who's a globally respected expert in online child protection, has been lobbying for better protection for children online since probably before I was born. And he chaired our advisory panel, which I'll talk about in a second. And then we had some academics who really kept us on our toes. So Abhilash Nair from Exeter University, Professor Sonia Livingston. Anybody who's working in the world of child protection can't have failed to come across Sonia. who's at the LSE, and then Simone van der Hoff, who's a professor at the University of Leiden, and her specialism is sort of law and particularly privacy. ACCS provided our audit and standards input, and then recently we've added a law firm called the New Paradigm in the Netherlands to provide us with some legal support. So we actually started the project without knowing how it would end. So we didn't have an answer at the outset. So we began by setting some principles on which we would base the project. And this was really what allowed that rather broad alliance of people to come together. I think it's fair to say our academics were particularly skeptical about the age verification industry when we began. I don't think they thought we could, prove people's age whilst protecting privacy, particularly the privacy of children. And concerned about some of the habits we might cause in children if we tried to persuade them that they ought to start sharing personal data online, for example. And equally, they didn't want age verification to become a barrier to children getting access to the online world. So one of the things that we effectively have signed up to, and we've put into the Articles of Association of the non-profit, is a commitment to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and Comment 25. And that includes the sort of things like the right for children to explore the internet and to get the benefits of the education that they can have and the networking opportunities and all those positive things about the internet, which if age verification was done badly, we'd just make it really easy for companies to just shut off access to children so they didn't have to worry about any of those awkward compliance things. We were also worried about children from what you might call non-conventional backgrounds, so children in care with foster parents, children whose parents weren't necessarily living together, or may have step parents. These are real complications, which I have to say on the parental consent side, we still a lot of work to do to really figure out how you create a system that just reflects the complexity of the modern family makeup. So our advisory board then was constituted, and this brought together all of the main trade associations involved in the internet in Europe, such as those worried about internet service providers or online gaming. We had Google and Meta sitting on the board, so we had some of the the biggest platforms in the world participating. We had representatives of European regulators, particularly through their representative bodies, the European Data Protection Board and EPRA, which is more on the audiovisual side. And we had people from the KJM in Germany and from the Irish Data Protection Commission. So one of the things and then we had lots of civil society. So CoFace, for example, is one of the big charities in Europe, which look after sort of parents and children and so on. Plus the British Board of Film Classification, I should mention as well. Anyway, this was a wonderful collection of all the stakeholders who should be worried about age assurance and parental consent. And I think actually one of the biggest successes of the project was just getting all of those people in a room together, along with competitors in the age verification business to try and solve the problem. So how did the technology work? So if you're familiar with the European Digital Identity System, the current version of it, version 1, EIDAS, we modeled it on that. Now, EIDAS is all about being able to do your tax return in Germany if you're Greek. And so what happens is if you are Greek and you've moved to Paris and you want to do your tax return, you try to log into the French tax system and it recognizes that you are not French and that you are in fact Greek, and refers you to the Greek identity provider, and you log into Greece, and then Greece confers to Paris that you are who you say you are. So it's a sort of a process of redirecting the user to somewhere where they've already proven their identity. So what we emulated in euCONSENT was that redirection. So in this example, user A is trying to access website A, which is age restricted, and website A is using an age verification provider, conveniently also called A. And so in the normal course of events, the user would go through the process of proving their age with that provider and getting access to that website. And then tomorrow, the same user wants to go to a different website, B, who uses a different age verification provider, B. And in the previous situation, they would just need to repeat the whole process. So choose a way of proving their age online and go through the process and get access to that site. Clearly, that's quite inconvenient if, for example, you're surfing the web and you're visiting 20 websites in an hour and you want to be able to prove your age to all 20 websites. So In our new situation, when you do that first check with provider A offers you the opportunity to accept a token. Sometimes I call this a cookie and I get told off by the techies because it's not apparently always a cookie. So let's just call it a token so I don't get into trouble. And you accept that token onto your device. And what that means is then tomorrow, the provider serving the new website can see that token. So all the providers go onto the same domain because you can't use third-party cookies. You can only have first-party cookies these days. So provider B can see the token. All the token says is this user has done an age check with provider A. It doesn't say how old that user is. It certainly doesn't have the user's identity involved. And all it is a signal to allow that user to be redirected back to the original provider. And then the original provider can confirm to the new provider that they're old enough to access the website. So it means the user doesn't have to go through the age verification process a second time. It may be that that original provider A asks the user to authenticate, so to prove that they are still the same person who did the check the day before. That might be a PIN or a biometric password, depending on the level of security. It might be something that's only requested once a month or once every 3 months, depending on what's a proportionate response to the level of harm on that particular website. But what it does mean is the user isn't stuck pulling out their passport a second time or trying to get their face into the right space on the screen to do an age estimation. And we took this solution and we piloted it across 5 different countries in Europe, Belgium, Cyprus, Germany, Greece, and the UK. In our largest pilot, we had 1,600 users in total, and 400 were in each of those countries, obviously collecting Greece and Cyprus together. And that meant that we had 3 categories of users. We had adults, we had children who were over the age of digital consent, and children under the age of digital consent. One little complication is the age of digital consent was different in each of those countries. So there was a requirement to figure out where the child was located to know whether or not we needed to start our parental consent process, or whether they could just prove that they were over anything between 13 and 16 and then on their own volition decide to access a site. The 3 providers involved were AgeChecked, Ageify and Yoti, along with 2 parental consent providers. JustProg already in that business. Upcom had to kind of quickly create a business because there was no second provider to interoperate with, and clearly it's hard to test interoperability if you've only got one provider. And then we created 5 dummy websites in 4 different languages, a bit of a mission in itself. And then the kids and the parents were essentially given what we called missions to navigate around those websites. And we checked to make sure they were only asked to prove their age when they needed to prove their age. So obviously for the first website, they all had to prove their age. But for the second website, if they already met the criteria and the age check they had done was to the correct level of assurance, then they wouldn't need to repeat it. So say the first thing they wanted to do was open a social media account, and they were 14 and they were in the UK, then all they needed to do was to prove that they were 14 and they would be able to open the social media account. If on the day after that they needed to prove they were 18 because they were going to our dummy alcohol site and trying to buy alcohol, then obviously that previous check wasn't good enough. So they would have had to do a further check if it turned out that they were in fact over 18 as well as being over 13 in order to buy alcohol. And so that logic was built into the system. We did 2 pilots. In the first one, we found quite a lot of issues with the sort of user experience. None of these were issues with our network of interoperability and that redirection process and how the tokens worked. They were all issues because we were suddenly asking 12-year-olds to use solutions which had been designed for their parents when they were buying wine or ordering cigarettes online. And clearly there was a mismatch in the language and the design and the user experience. So in the second mission, we tidied some of that up and we got 86% of the people through from the start to the finish of the mission they were asked to go on, eradicating some of the minor technical bugs that we'd had on some of those sites. So broadly speaking, for a small pilot, which was with 1.4 million euros, which I wouldn't like to describe as a shoestring, but in technical terms was not a huge budget. We demonstrated, we hope, what was quite a diverse solution. just to give you an idea of what that looked like to the users on their mission. They'd go to this alcohol site perhaps and be asked to prove their age. That site was using Yoti, so here were the Yoti options. You could use an ID, you could use age estimation, or you could use Yoti's reusable digital identity app. In this case, we've selected estimation. This is me trying to line my face up into the appropriate box to prove my age. And then having proven that I looked well over 18, goodness knows why I thought I looked over 18 with my youthful looks, but anyway, Yoti decided I was old enough and said I've proved to be an adult. And then we redirected people to a survey to just give some information on how they got on with that. The survey would then send them on to the next site, in this case, a dummy dating website. But instead of being referred to Yoti, or in fact, one of the other sites, I think this may have been AgeCheck who were serving these sites, you just saw this little whirry thing, a little pop up for a couple of seconds. And in those magic couple of seconds, what was going on in the background was a redirection back to Yoti. Yoti were telling AgeCheck that this user was old enough to access a dating site. And then you prove to be an adult and you're in. So that was the sort of the magic of the solution. So we were pretty pleased with ourselves with that. It worked pretty well. Parental consent was a lot harder, and I think we marked ourselves lower for this. The problem being that you have to give consent to each data controller independently. And so for a parent to give consent to their child to access one game, for example, you could not simply say, well, they said yes to Call of Duty, so they obviously mean it's okay to play Candy Crush. You have to go back and get consent each time. So the only thing we found was susceptible to reusability was the relationship we'd established between a child and the parent. So I always disparage the American copper system of verifiable parental consent as not very verifiable and not very parental, because there's no attempt in most of the system solutions to check that the person, the adult giving the consent, is actually the legal guardian, so the actual parent or the appointed legal guardian of that particular child. And I think that is something that we need to work on as an industry to decide, so how do we stop little brother just getting big brother to give them consent rather than actual getting proper consent from a parent. So if, however, you use the same relationship over a number of years because the same provider is always sorting out the parental consent, then you might be able to build some confidence through reuse that you've got the right parent, because hopefully at some point the parent will catch the kid if they've been cheating and figure out how that's happened and intervene, and that won't be a situation that lasts for a number of years. But there's definitely more work to do on that. And I think we may also look at generating a standard around parental consent so we can start to define what we mean by establishing that relationship. There could be a lot of clues that you could find. Can both the adult and the child get access to the same router, or put a password into each other's device? Do they share the same geolocation, just to stop somebody offering a service to kids anywhere in the world and saying I will provide attestation for $1 or something, So there's lots of work to do on parental consent, but we did at least manage to reuse the fact that we checked that the parent was themselves an adult. So the main achievements of the phase one was that, first of all, the characteristics, I should say, of the solution. It's a network, not a provider. I did not have a little black box in my house in Derbyshire, which is an hour down the road here, with every child's age in Europe. That's not how it worked. It was a network that connected independent age verification providers. And of course, those providers don't have a black box with everybody's age on either, because that would be really bad practice. That is not data minimization. Common levels of assurance, so you can reuse checks from one platform to another, knowing that they're going to meet the same legal requirements across each of the platforms. We needed a trust framework. If you're going to rely on a competitor to do your age check, you need to know that they're doing it as effectively as you are. So we had an audit and certification process, which we drafted, but we hadn't implemented. We trusted each other for obviously using dummy websites in a pilot. It's anonymized and tokenized. So as I said, there is no personal data hiding in those tokens. And all of the participating age verification providers are required to adopt data minimization and privacy by design as required by GDPR. And then there's minimum impact on the user experience. So if it works at scale, it would mean you generally just have to prove your age once, or maybe a second time when you were upgrading to a higher level of assurance, but you wouldn't be doing an age verification for every site you visit. And we didn't get involved in pricing. It was an open and competitive market. So relying parties, websites were still choosing which age verification providers they wanted to work with and paying them to do those age checks. So what were the achievements of phase one? Well, I mentioned our advisory board. We had great involvement in the governance, but also that stakeholder engagement, which brought together, I think, the right parts of the industry taken in the broadest sense. Going forward, we'd like to obviously expand that and have more than just 2 platforms, for example, involved. Obviously, having the EU's endorsement and putting their flag on what we do is helpful in getting credibility. And if you're going to have an interoperable network, it's sort of logical that you probably just need the one, because if you've got 2 networks, then that's not actually interoperability. It was an agreed mechanism for bringing providers together to solve the problem. So we could bring competitors together in a neutral forum to solve interoperability. We created this standard and certification process, which is what really has been the precursor to this conference, and the fact that there's an ISO standard being debated next door. And then finally, and to be honest, the smallest achievement was the software itself, which is what they call a Docker, which is an envelope full of code, which you could give to an age verification provider. They would integrate their solution, supposedly in a couple of days. Obviously, in the pilot, it took a couple of weeks, but over time that would get easier. But actually, the software, the mechanics of it was really the 5th of 5 achievements, because that's clearly going to have to be perpetually updated to keep up to date with the way the internet works and changes in that. So we did leave some issues unresolved, in particular the commercial model and contracts between providers. So if I am provider B and I'm using provider A's check, how much am I going to pay provider A of the fee that I'm charging to my client in order for them to be willing for me to reuse their check? And liability. So if that check is wrong and my client sues me, how am I sharing the cost of that legal action and any penalty that's due? And then untrackability and untraceability. And this is perhaps the biggest thing that's sort of come through. Obviously, we designed a solution which was completely anonymized. And at that time, that was a pretty good way of doing it. But what we have seen is particularly European regulators such as the French CNIL and the Spanish AEPD, so the data protection authorities, developing in sort of laboratory circumstances their own approach to age assurance. And those approaches have been designed to deliver what the French call a double-blind solution. The Spanish are very concerned to make sure that children cannot be easily found on the internet by bad actors for grooming purposes. So they want to see more sort of privacy enhancing technology involved in the process. And so what we will come on to talk about in our sessions on Wednesday, when we talk about euCONSENT and what we're going to do next for that, will be the next iteration. So sort of euCONSENT 2.0. But I'm going to leave that hanging, and that's just a little advert to persuade you to come back for that session. So that was euCONSENT. So this just sort of covers this, what else we'll be doing. So we do have some further funding from Safe Online, just to keep us operational for a year. And what we're hoping to do is to create that 2.0 solution and put that into live operation with real websites, which means we do need to solve the liability. We do need to think about the commercial arrangements and the contracts. And that will allow us to say that we've stood up a solution that works in the wild with real customers on real websites. So that's the next stage in our development. At that point, I'm very happy to take any questions. Fabulous. Well, we'll take 2 minutes for breath, and then Deepak will take over. Thank you very much.
Okay, morning all. We're just barely at noon. My name is Deepak, and I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Privately. We are. You sound a bit close to the mic for the people at home. Yeah, I'm naturally loud, I hope, but that should be okay. So I'm Deepak, founder and CEO of a company called Privately. We're based in Lausanne, Switzerland, and we have an office here in London. We've been delivering age assurance and online safety solutions for close to a decade now, though the age assurance bit has only been around for the last 3 years. But children's safety is something we've been developing a lot of technology around. And today I'm going to talk to you about a new project, which is a very exciting new project around a subject that is dear to almost all of us. We all often countenance, the attacks of deep fakes. We've been talking about it. What happens when deep fakes are made to attack age and ID assurance systems? And what we got a whole industry conglomeration to then tackle this problem. And that's what makes this project special. We're just at the starting of this project, so I wouldn't have as much data to tell you as Iain did in his previous presentation. We started this project just 3 months back. The project is called DefAI, or DefAI, as you would like to call it. And it is funded by InnoSuisse, which is the Swiss innovation agency, and the Innovate UK. And it brings together 4 parties, a research institute called IDIAP, the AVPA, represented by Iain and his team, privately, that is us, and AidCheck, which is ACCS, Tony Allen and his team, as you know very well. So I just introduced to you the team and what they are trying to do. Our goal will be to make sure that the next generation of age estimation, age verification systems, or ID verification systems have trustworthy robustness, demonstrable robustness to the attack of presentation and injection attacks, right? I know everyone might have their own claim about how robust their system is, but the purpose of bringing all these people together is to have a common language, a common way to measure how the robustness against such attacks can be measured on any age verification or any ID verification system. So IDIAP is a very well-known Swiss institute, and they do a lot of work on biometrics, synthetic data. They'll be presenting here on Wednesday, so if any of you wants to really see some of the work that is already being done here, please, very welcome to come on the DefAI Project presentation. So a lot of the research work is going to happen with IDIAP. Privately, that is us. We are a GDPR compliant age assurance company, which does on-device and on-browser age assurance using both face and voice. So as you can imagine, the bringing of multiple modalities, whereas face, voice, text, that already adds a flavor on how robust your systems could be. Our goal will be to extract that technology and implement it in a privacy-preserving fashion. So our claim to fame is that all our technology works on the user's device. So there is no data collection, there is no data extraction whatsoever. And we want to make sure that this project at the end also caters to those use cases, where when an injection or a check for an injection or a presentation attack is being done, it's done at the user level without necessarily extracting the user's data. An AidCheck, this is a very interesting one. I'm going to be talking on behalf of Tony here. But what Tony and his team want to do here is to standardize the kind of testing and the accreditation that will be tied up to robustness against generative AI attacks. So at the end of the project, we would probably see something like a metric or a standard onto which the industry can then comply. And the AVPA, as mentioned before, this is the other interesting part, though privately as a age assurance provider is involved in the project, but the best practices will be communicated to the larger industry, and that's part of what the project seeks to do. We are just, as I said, we are quite at the beginning. We had our first meeting in Lausanne in about less than a month and a half back, roughly 2 months back. This is our second meeting as a group together. And some of the findings from a technical point of view, some of the early synthetic data examples will be demonstrated on Wednesday. So you're more than welcome to come and talk to us there. And that's pretty much the level at which I can share at this point. We'll have much more details on Wednesday. Yeah. Thank you for your time.